So warm welcome to everyone to ODI. This is part of our In Conversation series. So we've got those of you in the room, so very warm welcome to you. But we've also got an online audience. I'm told there's 200 people online also listening in. So that's a welcome to you, those of you who are online. I'm Simon Gill. I'm one of the acting executive directors at ODI with my colleague Sarah Pantiliano. So we're leading the institute. My background is on the economic side. I initially came to ODI to run the budget strengthening initiative, doing advisory work in fragile states, and have, if you like, worked my way up. So, in terms of ODI, just to say very quickly who we are. We're the world's leading centre, maybe that's for other people to judge, but a leading centre in the world focused on research and analysis on aid and development. We've been very engaged on some of these aid effectiveness issues for many, many years. Many of our staff have been involved in different groups at the DAC over time. We've been involved in commenting about ODA, about the monitoring and assessing of ODA, and recommendations for improvement, and latterly a number of our teams have been very involved in the Leaving No One Behind agenda, which the DAC has also been very involved in. Introducing Susanna, we're really delighted to have Susanna here. She's just actually said to me that this is day 14 in the job. I knew she was new. I didn't realise she was that new. So we're really delighted that she's taken the opportunity to come through to London to join us in conversation, both here in person and obviously with people online. So we're really delighted about that. Susanna's I suppose I'm going to say, I'm not sure if I can say this about you now, but was a British diplomat and a civil servant. We had a previous incarnation a long time ago, although we should say not that long ago, in DFID. She was previously, before she joined the DAC, she was the British ambassador to Ethiopia and Eritrea, and also I think...
Not Eritrea then.
Oh, not Eritrea.
No.
Ethiopia and Djibouti, and also the permanent representative to the African Union and UNECA. She's also been the UK Executive Director to the World Bank, as well as when she was in DFID, heading up as Director for West and Southern Africa, and then had a previous incarnation doing lots of other things. Has got a PhD from LSE and an honorary doctorate from York. So congratulations on all of that. So just to explain the format, we're going to have sort of 30 minutes. I've got some questions I want to put to Susanna, and then we're going to open up for you, the audience, both here in the room and online, to ask questions. And it is generally, we're billing it's in conversation, it's conversational. We'll see where the conversation takes us, but there's lots to talk about. And if you're online, do send questions through, we'll pick them up. I've got an iPad here, I'll pick up the questions, and there'll obviously be time for people in the room to ask questions as well. So that's the plan. If you want to tweet, we've got hashtag Future of Aid, so do use that if you'd like to. And that's about it, so welcome. So Susanna, tell us a little bit, so day 14 in the job, kind of first reflections and maybe a sense of what you think your priorities are going forward.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, Simon. And any difficult questions, I'll say I just haven't been doing the job long enough. So let me flag that. I mean, the other thing I would say is I'm very much in listening and learning mode, and that's why this is such a good opportunity. I mean, both for people here, but also people who are online. You know, I'm in the market for good ideas. But so what are my first impressions? I mean, the DAC it's a fascinating beast, and unlike anything else I've ever done, it is the donor club, and I don't think we should be apologetic about that. That's its raison d'être. It is part of the development cluster within the OECD, which is then nestled within the wider multilateral organization. It's very different from the African Union. But interestingly, obviously, there are a lot of overlaps in terms of agendas. My first week, I did the biennial, that's once every 2 years, high-level meeting, and the second Latin America and Caribbean dialogue. So that was days 4 and 5. So that was something of a baptism of fire. But I think my takeaways, from the Latin America and Caribbean dialogue, was that there is a real willingness to engage with the DAC from Latin American and Caribbean countries. We talked an awful lot about South-South cooperation, the complementarity of different funding modalities. The Secretary General launched the No One Left Behind report, inevitably talked about that. And then the high-level meeting, I'm sure we'll come on to some of the specifics, but one of the most important things for me was approving the recommendation on the development, humanitarian, and conflict nexus, which is a certain sort of elegant circularity to it. As I, very early on in my career, worked in the humanitarian field for Save the Children, and did a lot of work on linking relief and development. And then when I was at DFID, wrote the first paper on security and development. So, things take time, but I think we're making progress. And otherwise, I was just very struck in the senior level meeting about the concern that we are off track in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and for all the enthusiasm of 2015, so far they are not mobilizing additional resources. So even though ODA is more or less flat, there is this terrifying figure that foreign direct investment has gone down by about 30%.
Okay, this is going to be an interesting conversation. I think I should be disciplined myself. Just on what you said, I've got three things in my head, so let me just bounce them back at you and you can pick up on them. I'm interested in, because we've got, obviously one of the things that ODI does a lot on is the humanitarian work, and Sarah leads that. So it'd be interesting just to pick up your highlights from that high-level meeting and what you think is significant coming out of that. I think, let me just hit you with three things, and then, so that was one thing. The other thing, I was just interested in your comment about Latin America and the Caribbean, and I suppose one of the things that came out, I think it was the high-level panel on DAC reform, was how the DAC, although I think you're right, you're obviously right, it's a donor club, but how you're going to engage with Southern partners. How do you think you could do that differently? And then obviously maybe we'll come back later on the off-track, the SDG thing, and leaving no one behind, and the relevance of that. But I don't know if you want to pick any of those threads.
Let's start with the humanitarian development recommendation. A DAC recommendation is a sort of legal mandate to allow the DAC to hold its members to account, to improve. It's the sort of stuff that ODI has been writing about for decades. To make sure that humanitarian and development interventions are properly coordinated, don't have a cliff edge, are greater than the sum of their parts. Now, there's nothing that the DAC as such can do to deliver that on the ground. That's for the operational agencies. What we can do, both in peer reviews and in meetings and other statistical work, is to make sure that our members deliver on it. So it's about accountability, it's about transparency, and I hope more and more it'll be about sharing best practice, but critically in this very difficult space about being quite honest about what doesn't work terribly well. The other piece is how we try and tackle another terrifying statistic, which is somewhere between a quarter and a third of official development assistance going on humanitarian. And as we know, every euro that goes on humanitarian relief doesn't go on development. So we've got to find a way of, again, discussing and incentivizing our members and our partners to get much, much better at conflict prevention.
Yeah.
So it's, I'd be very interested to hear what your thinking of it is, because it, having just come from Ethiopia, which has every year has a structural food crisis, plus, this year conflict, periodic drought. I mean, it is absorbing huge amounts of resource, huge amounts of money that I would much rather was spent on development. But the climate change and demographic pressures and just so many people trying to survive on rain-fed agriculture means that we're not out of the woods yet.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But just on the other point about Southern Voice and so just I suppose the worry is, I suppose, you have a donor club and the donor club does what it thinks best. And how are you going to get more voice, more transparency, more engagement? Or is that necessary?
It's definitely necessary. I mean, I think it's work in progress, Simon, to be honest. I mean, on transparency, I think the fact that, we have the peer reviews, that we collect the data, that we publish it, I think we're not doing badly. I know, some civil society organisations would like access to my inbox. It's not that exciting, to be honest. It is a bureaucracy and a multilateral, and there are member states who have particular positions. So I think we're not doing badly on transparency. We are, I think, doing well with Arab world donors, and I think, the Latin America and Caribbean was obviously my first one, but there was a definite willingness to continue the process and to continue the engagement. I don't think that the DAC has to replicate what's happening already around the world. So part of my job, I think, is to get out there to existing fora elsewhere and spread the word of the DAC. So, I'll be going to Buenos Aires in 10 days' time to the BUPA Plus 40 event on South-South cooperation. I don't think we should, do exactly the same at the DAC. Civil society organisations, my predecessor put a huge amount of effort into getting more civil society engagement. I spent the afternoon before my 2 days of meetings with civil society. They attended both meetings, and they spoke a lot in the sessions. I don't think either I or they think it's ideal yet, but it's certainly opening up the space. One of the questions that I had was, what do we mean by civil society? And to be honest, those who want to engage most with the DAC are those who are in the business of either development advocacy or delivery or both. And I think if one were to ask the question of our recipients, they might have a rather different interpretation of civil society. For example, the media or some of the more political organisations. So that's something I'd sort of push back to them. I think, and it would be a sort of general comment, I also said to them, I'm very keen to deepen the dialogue, to make it more regular, but on the condition that civil society organisations seek to become part of the solution to these enormous challenges that we're facing collectively. Yes, they have to hold me and the DAC to account, but it's so easy to criticise, and it's much, much harder to say, we think if you did this, it would make a difference. So I think, that for me is fairly near the top of the agenda.
Can I ask you that, just actually building on that, because we touched this before, is that, so for ODI, which is, our strapline is, evidence, ideas, change, that's what we want to do. And I think there are many NGOs sitting in the room who are about policy influence. So how do we influence people like you, or influence not necessarily you personally, but what should we be doing better? What would be our most useful contribution if we want to shape the future of aid, if we want to shape a better world? What should we be doing? This is just burying you in 100-page reports. Is that the answer?
Not that, please. No, I've got plenty of those on my desk already. I think it's, it's engagement. It's this sort of thing. It's really help. And I will take as much from this, if not more, as I will give. I'm very keen, actually, to get more speakers to come to the DAC to talk about particular things, because our membership, some of them are development specialists, others aren't. I think communicating we're I know we're all sort of down to 140 something characters, but very few people have time to read reports like that. So the more that there can be products that busy bureaucrats can digest. And it's probably trying to put yourselves in the shoes of people who are having to operate in a very political environment. So I think we were just talking very briefly beforehand, and I was being a bit swotty on the Eurostar and reading ODI's recent publications or the summaries thereof. And there was one that was talking about the need for all DAC donors to get up to 0.7. Well, that is a very politically contested space. So I think that, that's got to be addressed by ODI. The fact that, official development assistance is more or less flat in real terms. There was another point about needing to target, the very, very poorest countries. And I think Australia had been signalled out as sort of coming furthest down on this sort of two-way matrix of effectiveness and something else. And there's a very good reason for that. I mean, Australia is investing in small island economies in its neighbourhood. It's going to continue to do that. So it's introducing a bit more sort of realpolitik into the technical and economic analysis that would make it even more relevant.
Okay, we might come back on that. And I suppose just in terms of the other point you just picked up on earlier, where you said that we're off track on the SDGs, and you've just launched the LNOB report, the Leaving No One Behind report. So I mean, what's your take on? I mean, I suppose in a way, will your tenure at DAC be, in a sense, I don't mean this kind of personally, but will it say over the next 5 years, the donor community or development assistance community has made no impact on the challenges it set itself? Or are you hopeful, optimistic? What needs to significantly change?
I think there are two parts to this question, three parts actually. The first thing is leaving no one behind is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Even rich societies don't manage to do that. So, in a way, what we're talking about is inequality. And it's very clear, say from our Latin American and Caribbean dialogue, that inequality is increasing at a frightening rate, even in countries that are doing relatively well in terms of middle income country status. So our Latin American colleagues said, if you really don't want to leave anybody behind, therefore you should make graduation less of a cliff edge, you should make us eligible. But of course, every ODA contribution that goes to a Latin American country doesn't go to the very poorest ones. So you've got to think, are we talking about poor people within countries, or are we talking just about the poorest countries? The second thing for me, and I said this at the launch, and if there's going to be a focus of my tenure, it will be this. I was shocked and frankly ashamed to learn that only 4% of ODA goes to gender equality. 4. And that 63% of ODA has no gender equality objective at all. We have overwhelming evidence from a long time now to show that if you invest in women and girls, it's win-win. Women, girls who go to school will earn more, will have greater control over their reproductive health, will get married later, will space their children, will send their children to school, will spend the money that they earn on reducing household poverty, etc., etc., etc. So leaving no one behind, a pretty good place to start is with the 52% of those who are left behind who are women and girls. And I think unless we do something about that, it's extremely unlikely that we're going to make progress on other groups. And again, there is overwhelming evidence to show that societies that score relatively highly on gender equality tend to score much better on disability and other forms of exclusion and vulnerability. So that's where we need to start.
Right, and that's going to be a priority.
That it is, yep.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm sure people want to come back on that as well. I've got two quick questions, then I'll throw it open. One just on the graduation point that you just touched on. at the moment, the only kind of criteria is basically an income one. And I think ODI and others have been arguing for a much broader set of criteria. I mean, where do you see that changing, or?
Oh, gosh, this is a real can of worms, Simon, as you know. I mean, the DAC is a consensus-based organisation. So, and my job is to find the middle ground, to knit opposing views together, and then to try and provide some leadership in terms of the best of development cooperation. I have to say, I mean, after 14 days, I don't see a huge amount of appetite for changing that definition. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it is so complicated. And you would have at least 30 views on how it should be changed. So that's not to say it's not important, but as I say, at the moment, I don't think it's top of most people's agenda.
Okay, and then I suppose the key question as well for us, and I think ODI has done quite a lot of work on this, is the whole the DAC definition, private sector, concessional lending. Where are we on that? Where are you on that? Because I suppose sitting in the UK, there's obviously UK pressure to change the rules, and the fact that you're from the UK, does that make a difference? I mean, how does that play out?
I represent the entire Development Assistance Committee. It was actually one of the questions when I was interviewed by the committee was, can we be sure that you'll be independent? And the short answer is yes. I mean, there's, I'm my mistresses and masters now are the DAC members. So if there is a position adopted by any member that does not have a consensus, then it's unlikely to get through. I mean, I think the private sector instrument thing is, it's much misunderstood, I have to say. I mean, there's a lot of opinion on it, and it's very complicated, and I don't pretend to understand it all yet. But, the debate on, I mean, I think the decision was taken 4 or 5 years ago that, we needed to count instrumental and institutional. I mean, it's basically when the money goes in and when it comes out, simply, and that at the moment we can count both of it. The decision that was taken by the committee in December, before I joined, I mean, my fabulous vice chairs were doing the hard work on that, was purely about how we would count ODA for 2018. And the decision was, we need more evidence to know what we should do about this. So that's, that's where we are. Will it come back on the agenda? Absolutely. When, I don't yet know. I mean, I would sort of frame the question a little bit differently, which is, what's the problem we're trying to address? The problem we're trying to address is that we don't have nearly enough resource to achieve the SDGs, or to do the things that we say we want to do. So how are we going to crowd in other forms of finance? And the role of the DAC will be to make sure that those resources, to the extent possible, meet standards of best practice. And so I would want to sort of flip it. Okay. I think if we go down, we often sort of go down technical rabbit holes when things get too complicated. And at the end of the day, this is a political decision. This is a political decision about how members of the DAC persuade, their taxpayers, their public, to continue giving money, how they engage with other sources of finance. I mean, whether it's the private sector or multilateral development banks or whatever. That's the issue, and then it's how we score it. So I think, I mean, more generally, I'm very struck by how much the world has changed. I mean, even since 2015, and the sort of optimism we had, the Addis Ababa summit with the SDGs. We need to keep recalibrating how we keep this program on track. And I think to do that, we need to be looking forward rather than in the rearview mirror.
Okay, that's helpful. Actually, we've got an interesting report coming out about blended instruments just about to issue, which hopefully will contribute to that debate. So that would be good. I think I'm going to open it up actually now. I'll pick up questions online, but just maybe while I just get my technology sorted out. Any questions in the room? I'm going to go to the lady there, and then I'll go to... Oh, lots of questions. I'll go to you first, then I'll go to this other lady here, then to Gideon, and then I'll pick up... I think we've got mics roving round. If you could speak into the mic. If you could also actually say, you know, who you are and maybe which organisation you're from, that would be really helpful.
Sure, of course. Thank you. I'm Harpinder Kolakot. I'm the Executive Director of Development Initiatives. And this is a very timely and pertinent discussion. One of the things I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned was around what is the appetite of the DAC members with regards to actually improving their targeting of the ODA as well, particularly with regards to women and girls. As you've mentioned, it's an important agenda. There's strong evidence with regards to the impact it has on wider development outcomes. So what's the appetite there? But also to target much more specifically poorer people in poorer countries where resources are low. Again, we have to be very clear that ODA is not an infinite resource. It has particular purposes. It has areas where it's going to be much more effective. What is the appetite there of the donors to actually think much more strategically and evidence-based on what works where and how ODA can be directed into those places?
Great question. Well,
We're going to take a few.
Do you take a few? We'll take three. Is that all right?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back. That'd be fantastic. Sorry. And yes, please. I think there's a microphone just behind you. Thank you.
Thank you for your very informative presentation and questions already. So I just did my PhD with ideas. My research area focused on evaluation, especially development evaluation. And also I'm Chinese, so my questions relate to these two areas. So firstly, in terms of China as an emerging donor, so what's the strategic kind of direction in terms of involving or engage China as emerging donor? That's the first question. Second question relates to my own research area in terms of evaluation. Because last year I was following up the discussion with independent evaluation groups, evaluation unit. Carolyn Hyder, she's updating the evaluation criteria by OECD. So I want to know the current status in terms of the updating of evaluation criteria. That's my two questions. Thank you.
And Gideon, just behind. Yeah, thank you.
Gideon Rabinowitz from Oxfam GB. Firstly, just to welcome the progress that has been made on CSO dialogue. I've got colleagues in Paris who've been working around that and have seen some very welcome progress, so that is great, and we take on board the challenge that you've thrown our way. My question is, questions are around the ODA definition. I think one of the biggest concerns of NGOs has been the lack or the limits of evidence that have been brought to bear in that debate. It's been a very political discussion, but with very limited evidence around what type of reforms the definition actually will help and are actually going to incentivise the right development practice that we need. So it'd be interesting to know what plans the DAC has to, number one, generate evidence more broadly around this question of how appropriate the definition is, but also look at the changes that have been made recently and whether the sort of the right incentives have emerged from those changes. And then related to that, I think another concern of ours is that the definition agenda, and I suppose I'm sort of doing this myself, has dominated the discussions in the DAC. So if we want to get more progress on things like leave no one behind, we need to find a way to sort of structure and make more periodical the discussions around definitions. If we had reviews with evidence every 3, 4, 5 years, and we made it a more structured dialogue, it wouldn't necessarily dominate the agenda in the way that it is now, where constantly new questions are being brought to bear on the definition in a way that is in some ways dominating the debate and leaving limited space for issues like gender and leave no one behind. So
can I just be clear what you mean by definition? You're talking about what's eligible.
What's eligible and what activities are eligible to be reported as ODA.
Okay, thanks. Let's just pick up on those three because they're all chunky. There's
Yeah,
more
they
questions I know in the room, but and I've got some online as well. So, Susanna, do you want to?
Okay, I mean, look, I don't think I'm going to be able to give you, full answers because I just haven't been there long enough. But I'll do my best, and invite me back again in a year, and I'll do better.
We'll diarise it in.
Hoping that, I mean, the appetite of DAC members to improve targeting, on women, on the poor. I mean, I think the only thing I can say there is that in the senior level meeting, there was a lot of agreement on the need to do more on women in particular. To be honest, I think it's, how much you focus on the very poorest places, it depends, is the short answer. And there's a lot of evidence in our reports and I'm sure yours that shows. Countries have different priorities. And as we were saying earlier, I mean, do you focus on the very poorest countries, or do you focus on very poor people within countries? So there isn't an easy answer to that. And as I said earlier, any changes on this is a negotiation. But that's why I think focusing on women and girls is so important, because because it works. And also, it then allows countries that have, different policy priorities to be able to maintain those policy priorities, but nevertheless to make progress on leaving no one behind. I mean, great question on China. I mean, my personal view is that China is such an important player in development assistance, particularly in Africa, that nobody who is serious about development can not engage with China. There is, at present, quite a lot of technical engagement, I mean, in the development centre in particular, and, it is sort of under discussion as to precisely what the DAC should do. I mean, you will be more aware than anyone, that there are obviously sort of sensitivities and issues, but I think as a community, if we don't get serious about engaging with China, we will be judged very harshly in 10 or 20 years' time. I'm afraid I mean, when you say evaluation criteria, you're talking about peer reviews or more generally?
Because in the evaluation community, we basically refer to the several criteria set by OECD as very general guidelines in evaluation.
Yeah, okay. So it's my assistant, my advisor, Joachim, who I don't know the answer to this, but I'm sure, Joachim, you have the floor.
So it's been prepared in the network of evaluators, the evaluation network, and then it will be brought to the DAC, and the aim is to have a decision during the fall. So it'll be first discussed, and then, so that's the time frame for the evaluation criteria.
I haven't got to the autumn diary yet, I'm afraid, but I will make a note. Gideon, Oxfam, I mean, I to be honest, I don't feel able to answer your question comprehensively. I mean, the eligibility criteria are always going to be important, precisely because DAC members are having to manage their domestic constituents. And I think because the world is changing. The world is changing very, very fast. I mean, if I think of, what developing countries want now, certainly if you spoke to, where I've just come from, and I think much of East Africa, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. And I think it's very easy for us to forget that all those children who were alive because of the progress that was made on achieving the Millennium Development Goals are now in their late teens and early 20s. And they have huge expectations. And so they and their governments want something quite different. I mean, the second thing I would say is, if you take the peacekeeping 7 to 15%, I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's true. It is very, very difficult to make progress on any sustainable development outcomes unless peace breaks out, and all the data shows that extreme poverty is going to be concentrated in conflict-affected places. And I think, the DAC has to address that question. Now, I'm afraid I have not read yet the mountains of reports about the data and the evidence. Joachim probably has, if you want to add something. So I don't know, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. But it's really tricky, this how you strike the right balance between preserving the integrity of ODA, and ODA is a very, very special kind of resource. And the sort of Heineken resource, if you like, that reaches all those people that other resources don't, versus the reality on the ground. And I've just spent 3.5 years in the Horn of Africa. It is conflict and climate change and bad governments that are holding back the Somalias of the world, the South Sudans. We've spent so much trying to make a country like South Sudan succeed. Unless we get the conflict sorted out and the stealing from its people, we can't do anything else, So I think we've got to. It's not simply a question of. I sometimes get asked about, is ODA being diluted? Is it being polluted? And you sort of say, well, let's really ask citizens in those countries what they need and what they think. Just looping back to your earlier question about engagement. We're a donor club, but I think we need to listen much more to the voices of people in those countries, because sadly, their governments don't necessarily represent them. And that's another thing that I would really welcome from our civil society engagement, is some of those loud and powerful civil society voices from conflict and fragile states.
Actually, I'll come back to people in the room. Nice comment, actually, somebody from World Vision has commented, actually, Susanna, they're picking up your point about gender equality and their research. I think she's saying the low level of UK aid going to SDG 16.2, ending violence against children. And actually her question is, do you see a role that DAC could have in aligning monitoring of ODA with SDG goals? Actually, particularly what you said about gender. Is there a way in which the actual monitoring framework could be?
Ooh, gosh, you're getting.
I know it's a bit technical.
It is a bit technical. Give me time. There is some monitoring. I don't think it's completely aligned yet. I don't know. Joachim, is that something that has been discussed at length and dismissed, or? No. Maybe the place to ask that is at this 4-year stocktake in New York this summer, because that I think will convey the sense of urgency that I and many others feel. There's an awful lot of targets, as you know, so it may be that you need to select some that we think are transformational. And for me, it would be the two things, how much is specifically targeted on women and girls, and then how much is mainstreamed.
Okay.
But let me take a rain check on that.
Right, I've got a lady there who's keen to say as well too. Oh, lots. Okay, I'll go for the lady in the black, then I'll come to the lady in the purple, and then the lady behind, and then we'll try and be even and go to a man at the back. Yes, how's that? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you so much for an insightful conversation. I'm Fatin Hussein from the International Development Committee at the House of Commons. I happen to be managing an inquiry into DFID's work on disability at the moment. I'm really pleased to hear you mentioning disability within the work with women and girls that you're trying to lead on. I wondered whether you also have figures on how much of the DAC of the money is spent on disability. I've been struck by the material I'm writing that if you're looking into women being disadvantaged, trying to reach the poorest of the poor, that people with disability are always at an even bigger disadvantage because of the power dynamics here. So is this something that you think would gain more attention in the coming few years within the DAC or not? And a second question, you mentioned about the cooperation with South donors, that you're doing well with Arab donors, if I heard right. If you could say a bit more about that. Thank you very much.
Okay. I mean, on disability, I would point you to the Leave No One Behind report. It's a centimetre and a half thick, and there is a section in that on I don't have the figure to hand, I'm afraid, but what I would reiterate is that there is evidence to show that societies that do better on women and girls tend also to do better on disability. But I'm sure the number is in there. The Arab dialogue, I'll be honest with you, this was before I started. The last one was in Kuwait. I mean, the headlines from that are that they are very keen to engage, in terms of, what they're doing and what we're doing. So we will have that as a regular dialogue. And some of them, interestingly, came to the Latin American and Caribbean one and invited me to visit, which I will do. I've got a pretty busy travel schedule this year. I mean, I'm prioritising capitals of the member states because I think that's those are important relationships to have. But also, as I said earlier, sort of events that are in the south, so that I'm not sort of generating work for people, but things like the BAPA Plus 40, so that I can promote the DAC while also staying in touch with what's happening in developing countries.
Actually, there's loads of questions coming in. Let me just throw two at you from the online, and then I will come back to you. Actually, somebody on the BAPA, she said on the meeting in Buenos Aires, I would like to ask her what are her expectations about this meeting and what she would like to see as an outcome or outcomes from that meeting.
I mean, I don't know. No, that's impossible. I mean, the reason I'm going is because we had the organisers of it presenting what they were doing on South-South cooperation, and there was a huge amount of interest in the room. And to be honest with you, I don't feel I know enough about South-South cooperation. I mean, when I worked in India, we did a lot of work on it, but that was a decade ago. So I will be in learning mode. I think it's also, again, I think it sends an important signal that as the incoming DAC chair, I'm not just going to sit in Paris or London, or that I do want to go and learn from what developing countries are doing.
I think there's another question's coming about, you mentioned, touched on the issue about China, but people, and obviously you'll pick up with Brazil, but somebody's made a point about engagement with the BRICS more generally, and that's, which you kind of touched on. So let me move on to the lady there, and then the lady on the behind.
Thank you. Good morning. Liliana Parra, independent consultant from Colombia. Actually, my question was about South-South cooperation. It's increasingly important. It's been going on for a long time. So my question is, are there any priorities in the DAC to make it more sustainable and effective?
So I think there's a lot of interest in it, but not much understanding. And that's another reason for me going. But I think the fact that, we had a session, was sort of a couple of hours devoted to Latin American and Caribbean countries sharing their experiences, shows that there is interest, but I say not a huge amount.
Okay, we'll just pick up the ladies' question and Samvel at the back, and then maybe we'll take these two together, and then is that?
Okay, thanks. Claire Godfrey I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns at Bond. And I wanted to ask, do you think DAC donors are doing enough to leverage public finance, particularly compared to private finance? And do you think the DAC could do more to insensitise that and ensure that public finance is targeted towards the SDGs? And just a quick comment on civil society. I think civil society is a counterbalance to the state, and the state and government's responsible for human rights obligations, and so therefore I think there's always going to be a built-in necessary antagonism there. So I think we need to take that account and to not blur the lines too much. But that said, I do agree that we need to work together practically. But I just wanted to make that highlight that difference.
Right at the back, actually. Oh, good, thanks.
Thank you. I'm a public finance consultant. I was in Uganda recently doing evaluation of development partnership of National Development Plan. The issues you have mentioned or initiatives you have mentioned came across during the meetings, including humanitarian development, private sector financing, engagement with non-traditional donors, China, etc., etc. My question is, what do you think, how much of these issues needs to be taken at the central level versus at the fields level? Because there are a lot of these initiatives and engagement discussions, how much it should be taken at the central level and how much it should be taken at the country level.
By central level, do you mean by like DFID in London influencing the DFID office in Uganda? Is that, or are you talking about or donors on the ground
Donors
in
on the
Kampala?
ground, because there are development partnership on the ground, and sometimes this development partnership is coordinated by the government. So how much do you think you can take at the DAC level, and how much this needs to be taken at the country levels?
Okay. So Claire Bond, I mean CSO, of course. I mean that's kind of says it in the title, but I still think the it's a little like when we talk about the private sector. I don't think it's not a competition, and there is a way of these problems are so complicated and so difficult that what I would like to see is some putting our heads together to try and come up with some innovative thinking. But no, and I mean look, we're very happy to be held to account. But I want some good ideas. I need some help, to be honest. Public finance. Are you talking about domestic resource mobilisation in recipient countries?
Broadly, yes.
Yeah.
And there's coherence there with international public finance and flows.
Absolutely central, and something that, I mean, there's a lot of very interesting work going on in the OECD more widely about this, but we are not going to make progress unless we get that right. Now, I mean, how much the DAC can influence that is more complicated, but I think it's a very good illustration of us needing to sort of think beyond ODA and to see how we can join up these different sources. I'm not sure if I've understood your question, but it would seem to me that this is not country level or DAC. It's actually the development agencies or country level. So, I mean, but I don't think that's so much for the DAC. I mean, I think it's that, USAID or Swedish Seed or whatever. I mean, that will be a conversation within the development ministry or the development agency, how much they devolve, if you like. But I think for the DAC, I think we're operating at a slightly more sort of strategic level, probably. I'm not sure I understood your question. Please come back if I didn't.
In general, regarding the blended financing, humanitarian development, private sector, how much of these discussions needs to be happen at the central level versus at the local level? The same in regard to engagement with non-traditional development partners, for instance, China and others, when there's a lot of assistance coming from them at the country level.
Is the answer. Because, one of the things that, I think that the DAC needs more of is more evidence of what's happening on the ground, what's working and what isn't. I think one of the useful things the DAC does is to, if you like, pool all that expertise, bring in people, from developing countries, but also specialists to have the conversation. And I hope very much one of the things that we can build on is making sure there's more of an iteration between the sort of rather high-level conversations we have and what this actually feels like.
Actually, it's just a nice plug for an ODI publication here, because we did some work called The Age of Choice. One of the case studies was on Uganda, looking at actually the choice that the government of Uganda has in terms of financing from different sources, both conventional donors and new sources, and that is a useful contribution. And actually, and as I said, we've got some interesting work coming out on blended finance. So I think there was a question on from Sam.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, go on. Yes, why not?
Because, I mean, actually, one of the things that's worrying me is the whole development effectiveness agenda. So we talk a lot about development effectiveness and this GPDC.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about impact. And I mean, my sense is that we're not making very much progress, to be honest. And I think that's partly to do with domestic issues in DAC member countries. You know, the zeitgeist is challenging and it's changed. It's partly to do with, I think, development effectiveness. It's talking to the conoscenti, but it's not talking to the wider world. I don't know whether it was because we set ourselves too much of a challenge, but I mean, my question to you is, what do I do about it?
Okay.
And have you got any, you know, I mean, I'm sure you've got something I can read, Simon, that you know. Anybody I should talk to?
No. It's a good challenge to us. We won't just bury you in paper. So I've got Sam, and then I'll come to Sarah, and I've got some other comments online as well. So Sam, did you? So, and also just for those of you in the room and online, so Susanna's in the market for ideas on development, how to stimulate or reinvigorate the development effectiveness debate. So answers on a postcard.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, is development effectiveness the same as impact? Has impact overtaken development effectiveness? Is it?
Okay,
Yeah.
So hopefully we get some ideas back as well. But Sam, you go.
Good afternoon. I'm Sam. I'm a senior research fellow, and I've been working on this blended finance issue. So I'll be just brief. It's really a plea, actually, and a plug. Firstly, on the ODA modernisation, you know, you've recognised it, and we know it's very complex. It's gone down a technical rabbit hole as such, and you've highlighted the need really to kind of strip it back to the problem that we need to address, and in that light, the need for evidence. So in that light, I'm looking forward to sharing with you a report coming out, which is looking actually at leverage ratios in countries, country income categories and sectors, etc., to kind of try and calibrate, you know, this discussion. So hopefully it can help you there. And in that sense, you also mentioned about trying to get more engagement with the DAC and outside kind of speakers and experts. So hopefully we'd like to speak to you about that. But in the meantime, I think it's a plea for transparency. You said that the DAC was doing rather well. And I would question that when it comes to the recent reform, particularly with respect to private sector instruments. And without getting too technical, and it is your second week in the job, there has been a whole level of transparency which has been removed, for example, by the ability of donors, for example, the UK, to report the 3.5 billion capitalisation as ODA. And for researchers, for example, or the taxpayer, they need to then go to the CDC kind of database and etc. So I think you get. So the idea is more transparency, but also it's very difficult, for example, on the recent reform. There's communication on how certain things are treated, and then there's silence on other things. So I think kind of just a plea to kind of be more transparent. We recognise that there are challenges, but I think if there's more transparency, we can kind of try and understand actually what's going on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a really good challenge. I mean, let me take that away. I mean, I'm not into the detail enough on specifically on that one. And look, I mean, you know, something that will give us some evidence about leverage ratios is critically important, because I must confess, we also go, yeah, blended finance, as if we all know exactly what it means, and it is the leverage ratios that really make a difference. So I look forward to it. Maybe you'll come and brief the committee. But we are civilians, remember, so you have to...
We'll get her to talk in, very broad language, not just very technical, and we'll buy her a ticket on the Eurostar, that's for sure. Sarah.
Thanks, Simon. I'm Sarah Pantriana, Acting Executive Director at ODI with Simon. Thank you, Susanna, for being here and for such an engaging conversation. It's very timely because he also chimes with a lot of thinking on these issues we continue to have at ODI. I want to go back to the beginning of the conversation and the perennial debate on humanitarian development and now peace nexus. And you're right that it takes a long time to to advance on this agenda, but we have been going at it for 30 years or more. And, sometimes I kind of think we see this reinvention of the labels. We started with the continuum, we went to the contiguum, linking relief and rehabilitation and development, and then, early recovery, resilience, you name it, and now we have the nexus. And there is, a danger that we just slightly reframe the discussion, but we actually don't really, make serious advancement on the agenda. I mean, I really welcome, I read very carefully the recommendations of, the high-level panel, particularly when it comes to the joint analysis and the country-based joint analysis, which is, a prerequisite. But we've done a lot of work on this at ODI, on this agenda for a long time. And quite frankly, until the structures, the incentives, and the culture change, I think these, risk remaining at best an ambition and worse an enduring frustration for all of us that work on this agenda. So it would be, really good to carry on the discussion. But what we can really do and help you, do to achieve some tangible change during your tenure on this agenda.
I've got some. Susanna, do you want to just pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, look. Sadly, Sarah, there are no silver bullets on this. And what we managed to do with the recommendation last week was just one little brick in the wall, but it's only as good as, as you say, the agency is concerned. It's only as good as their willingness to change. And, I do think it's very cultural. Very, very cultural. And I mean, having worked on both sides, I understand the ethnography of both villages. And what I find, sort of worrying, quite exhausting, is actually how little it's changed. Because we know it has to. And even when you have, more or less permanent crises, it still doesn't really change. So I don't know what we do about that, whether we, it is incentives, but I think it's having different sorts of conversations, getting people in the room. But, unfortunately, I mean, we know that the resource competition is driving an awful lot of this.
I've got a question from Brussels. The DAC has made great progress on formal tying of aid, or probably I assume progress on untying. Yeah, I think that's what I mean. But current research shows that informal tying remains high as a consequence of procurement policies. Any kind of these are very specific ones. Yeah. Any comment on that? And I've got two others which are quite specific as well. There's a morning greeting from Canada just come in, which is very nice. But please ask the DAC Chair about action being taken by DAC on sexual harassment and abuse of staff at UN agencies, UNAIDS, for example, and why so little action is being taken by donor member countries to seek results. So that's a kind of. So how about those two? For starters?
So look, untying, I agree. And I think we need to sort of keep the conversation going. But it definitely is the case. I don't have any detail. So on sexual harassment, I'm not going to talk about specific agencies, but we did have I think a very, very important discussion about this at our senior level meeting. And, for me, it's a very good example. I think the DAC is seen probably not as being quite as fleet of foot on some issues as some would like. But this has been a really very, very rapid response, to this scandal, and we have agreement to take the work forward. And I hope, sooner rather than later that it'll come back, and we will have a recommendation. It's not without difficulty, and some of the, there was overwhelming support for the need to do something. I think where the meeting raised some questions was that we need to be really careful we do not create a structure or a framework that we then can't deliver against. And this is particularly true with some of third-party operators. So again, I think the DAC as the sort of rule setter. What we need to do is to say this is what we think best practice looks like. Ideally, get it into the mandate, but then it is up to the agencies concerned again, and it comes back to culture, to change the culture. I mean, this, this is about everybody, and it's really important. I think for anybody working in this business to take personal responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen.
Okay, I've got any other questions in the room? Marcus, yeah, and then I'll come to Adrian, and then I've got I've got a couple more online as well, actually, at the moment. So those of you online, keep sending the questions in. We are getting through them, so we won't ignore you. But Marcus, you go.
Hi, Marcus Cox here from Agulhas Applied Knowledge, and I work with the UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact. I have a question as to whether or not you see a broader trend in the aid market towards more donor national interest intruding on the allocation decisions around aid, and whether you see that as a problem that the DAC should be trying to resist, or whether or not that's just part of the new political reality that we work in.
Yes, I bumped into Alison Evans at the DAC last week. She and I are old colleagues. What's your start date?
You mean for...
Yeah.
Well, Agulhas have been involved with ICAI...
Yeah, no, but I mean, what's your start date for...
For this trend?
Yes.
I think in the UK, 2015 was the UK aid strategy.
Okay, see, I would sort of take it further back. I mean, I think there was a golden decade, if you like, that was approximately sort of 97, 98 till the financial crash, and it may not have been as apparent in all countries, but things have changed fundamentally, and I think that is due to lots of things. I mean, one is that in many of the donor countries, austerity is biting. The people feel that resources should be being spent on poverty at home and one thing and another. I think that, it loops back to my development effectiveness question, is I think there is growing skepticism in some quarters that, does this really work? Are we getting value for money? And I think some of the optimism of that golden decade was a little misplaced, to be honest. I mean, I do think there was a sort of feeling if we could, we just get these economies growing, everything will be fine. And we didn't factor in the governance challenges, and we didn't factor in the conflict. We certainly didn't factor in demographic pressure, jobless growth. So I think there's a sort of been a coming together of a whole series of things that has meant that our task is much more difficult, but that's I enjoy a challenge, and I don't think we should give up. I think we do need to be realistic and honest, and one of the things that I'm very struck by is how polarised the debate has become. So you're either for development assistance or against, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle, actually. And I think that's another role that the DAC can play. I mean, I think we need a much stronger, fresher, more modern brand and message. And I don't think that message should be too reluctant to say we've got some real problems here. And these are the things, we'll probably learn more from what's not working than what is. And I mean, one of the issues that came up in this meeting was, what do you do? I mean, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states, but not exclusively, where there are governments that are really not very interested in poverty reduction. I mean, it's not a rhetorical question, So I think countries, it was something that our Latin American colleagues answered they sometimes feel as if success is penalised. That if you do manage to get your income levels up, that's the moment when the resources stop flowing. So, it's much that there's a lot of grey that I think we need to spend more time on, to be honest.
I mean, we've got we've actually done a lot of work, advisory work and other work, humanitarian work in South Sudan, and actually we did a lot of work in terms of getting, this was in the Ministry of Finance, getting actually the Ministry of Finance accounts and reports online, which actually don't make happy reading, but in a way there were people in the Ministry of Finance who were keen to do that. So with support from outside, they were able to do that, and that's not made the situation any better in one sense, but it has made it more transparent. So I think there are things at different levels you can do. I've got actually I've got an online question. I think there's several questions about corruption in general. You know, what is the DAC doing on corruption? But I'll just leave that just hanging and just pull in the question from Adrian, and then maybe you can come back on that one as well.
Thank you. Hello, Susanna. Adrian Hewitt, ODI. I'd like to ask you how confident you are of keeping the Americans on board during your term. You mentioned that the DAC and presumably the OECD itself is a multilateral institution in your opening remarks. This administration has been more, shall we say, ambiguous towards multilateral bodies than any since it all started with Truman, if you like, going right back to Truman. And certainly in the first few decades of the DAC, the chairman was always a man and was always an American, and you're neither of the above. So how is your task, how does the task ahead look to you? Thank you.
I mean, look, it is my job to keep all members on board. And I think many DAC members, I mean, it goes back to my answer about the sort of golden decade, are far more, are dealing with publics and in some cases governments that are far more sceptical about aid than they used to be. So, you know, that's the job, if you like. I mean, if everybody were pulling in the same direction, then I wouldn't have a job. You know, they are an extremely important donor, and we have, you know, I would sort of emphasise the fact I think there are many members who, for a variety of reasons, are either, you know, questioning the validity of ODA, unable to give as much as they used to. You know, I'm thinking some countries, you know, others who are spending it on particular things rather than others. But I mean, it is there are a very broad set of political views. I mean, I think, Adrian, your question sort of goes to the heart of my job, which is essentially it's a diplomatic and a political job. It's not a technical one, and you know that is really important. That you know, if I'm going to be effective, I have to engage with the political positions of all my members, and there will be very different views.
Can I just ask you just on that, because many of us, I think, in the room have been involved in kind of technical working groups at the DAC, and you know we would say we've given our technical best, but it hasn't maybe made the impact we had hoped. So just to helping us, those of us who are involved at a technical level, I mean, how do we bridge that gap? So you're operating at that diplomatic political level, and we're sometimes engaging at a technical level. I mean, how do you make that I mean, is that the DAC's job to do it, and we should just or should we be more politically savvy as we interact at the technical level? I mean, what?
Well, I think if you were, it would make my job easier. But I can see that you know, there's I think, as I said earlier, that because a lot of this stuff is very technical and very complicated, and there's an awful lot of it, that's the sort of safe space. The trouble is, you take those technical issues into the DAC, which is representing sovereign states, and that's where the problem starts. So I mean, it's a big part of the job of my office is not, you know, it's not for me to take a view on particular sovereign states' political positions. It's for me to try and build consensus. I mean, that's sort of diplomacy 101, unfortunately. But you know, that's what I like. So and look, if you would, you know, if you had a crystal ball, I mean, the political consensus about aid is going to continue to change. So, I mean, one question I'm often asked is, is reform, DAC reform, institutional reform done? Is ODA modernisation finished? Absolutely not. I mean, if the DAC doesn't keep changing and responding to the changing realpolitik of its members, then it's not going to be relevant.
Okay, now I've got to pin you down on anti-corruption.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think collectively we're worried about it. What are we doing, Joachim?
There's actually a recommendation.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, but Joachim, go.
Yeah, so there's actually a DAC recommendation on managing the risk of corruption and anti-corruption measures for development agencies. So it's followed up through the peer review instrument, but also through special reporting.
Big issue, obviously, for if we're going to expand the membership.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe the final question, Jesse. Yes, you can have that one.
Thanks. Jesse Griffiths from ODI. It's not a question, it's just a couple of responses or comments. One is on the development effectiveness agenda. I think it's worth remembering, so when it was called the Aid Effectiveness Agenda and it was housed at the OECD-DAC with the Working Party, and then it's shifted to being at the GPDC, OECD UNDP thing, the resources available to that agenda plummeted. So I think doing all you can to persuade your members to re-resource that agenda would be a really important thing to do. Second point about this discussion about the national interest, we've got a great new product coming out in the next couple of weeks called a Principled Aid Index, and that's an attempt to reframe the discussion and to say that actually using aid to help development, end poverty, have a stable, secure world is in our long-term national interest. And if we divert aid to, for example, the question about tying aid to subsidize a few of our companies for our short-term gain, we actually undermine our own national interest. So I think redefining that debate is really important.
Thank you very much. I will read that with interest. So on development effectiveness, I'm delighted Switzerland has taken over the chair, and we've got a lot of GPDC meetings coming up. But I mean, I think, to be honest, Jesse, resources and sort of results, impact tend to go together. So I think we've got ourselves into a bit of a vicious circle here, that the resources are not going into it because people are not convinced that this is delivering enough. So, it's how do we breathe life back into this agenda, and then, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm struggling a bit to, other than to say it's really important, to really go out and make the pitch for it, because I think I'm not quite sure what it is anymore.
We'll hold you, Susanna, you said you offered to come back in a year's time.
Yes.
I think the challenge for us in ODI, and maybe a broader group of people in the room, is how do we customise the work we do in a way that's really helpful for you and others, and I think that's a challenge I take back. The other question I wanted to ask you, which is kind of more like a gentle last question, but I know we've got people in the room who are doing PhDs, the lady who asked the question as well, and you did a PhD at LSE, and you've had an illustrious career in international development. Hopefully the best is still yet to come. What's your advice to people at the start of their career? How do we become like you?
Oh gosh. Well,
what would you advise?
First thing is don't have a plan, because I never did. I think there is no substitute for working in developing countries. I mean, I worked in northern Mali for 4 years, and those, what I learnt there, I've never forgotten. But then equally, having just been in Ethiopia, after London, Washington before that, even as ambassador, it sort of reminds you what you're doing and why you're doing it, and don't stay in Addis Ababa. Get out and about as much as you can. I mean, the other thing I would say is I've worked in lots of different bits of the system, and before this job, maybe most recently, as in the Foreign Office, that I think if you've got to be able to come at it from all sides. And if I were starting out now, I I think in the future, people are going to have to be as comfortable working in the diplomatic space as in the development space, as in the financing space. You know, some would argue in the security space. And the most effective operators are, you don't have to be expert in all of them, but you're comfortable in all of them. And it goes back a little bit to this humanitarian piece. I mean, you think if development professionals and humanitarian professionals can't work together, what help is there for a mere diplomat? I mean, so it's that. I mean, the other thing is just just stay flexible, because you get the most extraordinary opportunities.
Okay, good. We haven't. There's a question actually coming, a really good question actually about mental health. Apparently, the statistic is $132 million is reported to the DAC for ODA spend on mental health, and that's a massive issue affecting 1 in 4 people. How can we do more about that? There's another big question that's come in about migration, south-south migration, and that's another big topic which we really haven't had time to explore. I don't know if you've got any silver bullets on either of those.
It's just, there's a very important project in Ethiopia actually with some British psychiatrists, and I mean it is a huge problem. But I mean in a country where there is the health needs are so great. I mean they've achieved fantastic things in terms of primary health care, but secondary and tertiary, there's still an enormous way to go. And I mean, they are training huge numbers of doctors, but rather like this country, to be honest, I mean, mental health historically doesn't get the attention it needs. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think it's unlikely that it's going to be prioritised anytime soon. Sadly. Migration is an enormous topic. We might have to have a separate conversation about that. I mean, I think it goes back to the point that Marcus, I think it was, made about we are all thinking differently about development. And I would say what we can't do is not talk about it, and what we can't do is to let the debate be as polarised as it has been, because these are sort of 21st century problems that are dividing communities, and we have to have a debate that isn't for or against. We've got to have a debate about solutions.
Great. I think our time's up, I'm afraid. Really sorry, everybody. I think we've got a huge amount out of you. I don't know if you feel you've got anything out of us. I think one of the things I've really taken on board for us is this challenge of producing information in a really accessible form for people like you to digest, and I think that's a challenge for us and others to do. I think the issue about the link between the technical and the political is really important, well taken. And thank you for answering questions on China, humanitarian development, mental health, migration, gender. Great to have that plug, particularly on that. We've got another event tomorrow on International Women's Day, but it's great to have the importance of gender and working with girls and young people, and hopefully those of you who are younger, we're called born earlier is the phrase we use now. We're born earlier. Those of you who are at the start of your career, take note of Susanna's advice for you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for those online. I think I've done just about justice to all the questions online. Apologies if I haven't. Thank you for contributing. You might be able to catch Susanna if you're quick, if you really want to buttonhole her. Otherwise, if we could all give Susanna a round of applause. And we'll book you in for a year's time.
Thank you. And I have actually learned a huge amount. I would just say 2 things in closing. One is podcasts are brilliant because you spend a lot of time on planes, so right. Good podcasts. And what I said in the Council of the OECD was, it's International Women's Day tomorrow. Can governments take the opportunity to recommit to spending more on women and girls and be held to account? But thank you all very much.
Thank you.